The whiskey glass froze halfway to his lips when the first note rang out, clear and pure as church bells on Sunday morning. And Ranger Cole Novak knew in that instant his life would never be the same. It was July 1882 in Deming, New Mexico, and the Silver Dollar Saloon had been his second home for the past 3 months since he drifted into town with nothing but a worn saddle, a reliable horse, and a past he preferred not to discuss. The establishment was the usual rough establishment, smelling of tobacco smoke, spilled liquor, and the perpetual dust that seemed to coat everything in this desert territory. Men played cards in the corner, their voices a constant rumble of curses and laughter. The piano player usually banged out bawdy tunes that made the saloon girls giggle, and the miners stomped their boots. But tonight was different. The woman stood on the small wooden stage near the back wall, illuminated by the golden glow of oil lamps that cast shadows across her face. She wore a simple dress of deep emerald green that seemed almost too refined for this rough place, her dark auburn hair pinned up in a way that revealed the elegant curve of her neck. When she opened her mouth to sing, the entire saloon fell silent as if God himself had commanded it. Ranger set down his glass slowly, the amber liquid forgotten. Her voice soared through the smoke-filled air, transforming the crude establishment into something sacred. She sang an old hymn, Amazing Grace, but the way she performed it made every hardened cowboy, every grizzled prospector, every cynical gambler stop what they were doing and simply listen. The notes seemed to hang in the air like something tangible, something you could reach out and touch if you were brave enough. He had seen plenty of saloon singers in his 32 years. Women who sang off-key while men pawed at their skirts. Women who shouted bawdy lyrics to earn their keep. But this woman sang like she had forgotten where she was, like she was alone in a great cathedral somewhere far from this dusty New Mexico town. Her eyes were closed, and tears tracked down her cheeks as she sang about grace and redemption. Ranger felt something crack open inside his chest, something he thought had died 5 years ago in Colorado, when his wife and infant daughter had succumbed to scarlet fever in the space of a single terrible week. He had spent those 5 years drifting from town to town, working odd jobs, occasionally hiring out his gun to protect wagon trains or hunt down rustlers. He had deliberately carved out his own heart and left it in that cold ground with his family, because feeling nothing was easier than feeling everything. But this woman's voice cut through all his carefully constructed walls like a hot knife through butter. When the song ended, silence hung in the saloon for a long moment. Then applause erupted, rough and genuine, the kind of appreciation these hardened men rarely showed. The woman opened her eyes, and Ranger saw they were a striking shade of gray-green, like sage after rain. She looked startled by the response, as if she too had forgotten where she was. "Another one, Miss Felicity," someone shouted from the back. The bartender, a portly man named Dutch who had been wiping the same glass for the past 5 minutes with tears streaming down his face, nodded vigorously. "Please, Miss Kelley, if you would honor us." So her name was Felicity Kelley. Ranger rolled it around in his mind, tasting it like fine whiskey. She sang 3 more songs that night, a Scottish ballad about lost love, a folk song about a river running to the sea. And finally, a song in Italian that Ranger did not understand but felt in every fiber of his being. By the time she finished, his untouched whiskey had grown warm, and every man in the saloon was looking at her like she had offered them a glimpse of heaven. When she stepped down from the stage, Ranger found himself standing without conscious decision. He moved through the crowd, aware that 6 other men had the same idea, but something drove him forward with unusual determination. He reached her first, blocking the others with his considerable frame. Up close, she was even more striking. Not beautiful in the conventional way of saloon girls with their painted faces and calculated smiles, but beautiful in a way that made his throat tight. Her face was pale and fine-boned, with a small scar above her left eyebrow that somehow made her more real. She looked tired, he realized, tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. "Madam," he said, pulling off his hat. "That was the most remarkable thing I have ever heard." She looked up at him, and something flickered in those sage-colored eyes. Wariness, perhaps. She was clearly used to men approaching her after she sang. "Thank you kindly, sir." Her speaking voice was different from her singing voice, lower and slightly rough around the edges, with a faint accent he could not quite place. East Coast, maybe. Certainly not from anywhere around here. "Can I buy you a drink?" The words came out before he could stop them. "Just to talk, I mean." "I do not mean any disrespect." She studied him for a long moment, taking in his worn but clean clothing, the careful way he held himself, the genuine respect in his eyes. Something in his face must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "A glass of water would be appreciated." Water. Not whiskey or beer or even sarsaparilla. Water. It told him something about her circumstances that she chose the one thing that cost nothing. He guided her to a corner table, away from the noise and the curious eyes. When Dutch brought over a pitcher of water and 2 glasses, Ranger pressed a coin into his hand. "For the ladies' performance." Dutch nodded and shuffled away, leaving them in relative privacy. Felicity drank the entire glass of water in one long swallow, then poured another. Ranger waited patiently, sensing she was gathering her thoughts. "You are not from Deming," she said finally. It was not a question. "No, madam, I have been drifting for some years now." "Yourself?" "Boston," she said. "Originally, though that seems like another lifetime ago. Boston." That explained the refinement, the way she held herself despite the obvious poverty of her situation. "Long way from home." "Yes." She traced the rim of her water glass with one finger. "Though I have no home to return to, so the distance hardly matters." Before Ranger could respond, a commotion erupted near the bar. A drunk miner was arguing with one of the saloon girls, his voice rising to a shout. Ranger tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the pistol at his hip, but the bartender and 2 other men quickly hustled the troublemaker outside. The incident was over in moments, but when Ranger looked back at Felicity, she had gone pale. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Fine," she said quickly, but her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her glass. "I am not accustomed to such places, even after these past few months." "How did you end up singing here?" The question was bold, perhaps too personal, but Ranger found he desperately wanted to know her story. She hesitated, then seemed to decide he was trustworthy enough. "My father was a music professor in Boston. He taught me to sing from the time I could talk. After he died last year, I discovered he had debts I knew nothing about. Everything we owned was sold to pay them. I had some foolish notion about going west to teach music, perhaps start a school. But when I arrived in Santa Fe with barely enough money for food, I realized how naive I had been. No one wants a music teacher out here. They want women who can cook, clean, work the fields. I made my way south, working where I could, and ended up here 3 weeks ago. Mr. Dutch was kind enough to let me sing for tips and meals." The story was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Ranger had seen it before, educated Eastern women heading west with dreams and finding only harsh reality. Many ended up in brothels or married to the first man who would have them, desperate for security. "You have a gift," Ranger said quietly. "A real gift." That voice should be heard in concert halls, not in a saloon in southern New Mexico. She smiled then, a sad smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Should be, perhaps, but we live in the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. The saloon pays enough for a small room and one meal a day. That is more than many have." They talked for another hour, their conversation ranging from music to literature to the strange beauty of the desert landscape. Felicity was educated and well-read, with opinions on everything from politics to philosophy. Ranger found himself talking about things he had not discussed in years, ideas and thoughts he had buried along with his old life. She made him remember that he was more than just a drifter with a gun, that he had once been a man who read books and had dreams. When the saloon began to empty out for the night, Felicity stood reluctantly. "I should go. Mr. Dutch lets me sleep in a storage room upstairs, but he locks up at midnight." Ranger stood as well, towering over her by nearly a foot. "May I walk you upstairs?" She nodded, and they made their way through the thinning crowd. At the bottom of the narrow staircase that led to the rooms above the saloon, she turned to face him. "Thank you for the conversation, Ranger. It has been a long time since I talked to someone who did not treat me like a curiosity or a potential conquest. The pleasure was entirely mine, Miss Kelley." He hesitated, then took a chance. "Will you sing again tomorrow night?" "Every night," she said. "It is my employment." "Then I will be here to listen." Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the careful walls she had built around herself. "I would like that." Ranger returned to the silver dollar the next night and the night after that, and every night for the next 2 weeks. He always arrived early, claimed the same corner table, and sat nursing a single glass of whiskey through Felicity's performance. Afterward, they would talk for an hour or more, their conversations growing deeper and more personal with each passing night. He learned that her mother had died when she was young, that her father had never recovered from the loss, and had poured all his love and attention into teaching his daughter music. She had expected to become a music teacher in Boston, perhaps eventually marry some professor or businessman and live a comfortable, cultured life. The revelation of her father's gambling debts had shattered that future completely. In turn, Ranger found himself telling her about his own past, something he had sworn never to do. He told her about growing up on a ranch in Colorado, about marrying his childhood sweetheart Mary when they were both 20, about their joy when their daughter Sarah was born. He told her about coming home from a cattle drive to find them both sick with fever, about watching helplessly as they died within days of each other, about the crushing guilt that he had not been there when they needed him most. "You could not have saved them," Felicity said gently when he finished. They were sitting in their usual corner table, the saloon nearly empty at this late hour. "Scarlet fever takes who it takes. Being there would only have meant you likely would have died too." "I know that in my head," Ranger said, "but my heart has never accepted it." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. It was the first time she had touched him deliberately, and the contact sent electricity through his entire body. 5 years is a long time to punish yourself. "I am not punishing myself. I am just existing." "That is the same thing," she said softly. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them was quite ready to name. Then Dutch called last drinks and the spell broke, but something had changed between them that night. Ranger felt it in the way Felicity smiled when she saw him arrive the next evening, in the way her eyes sought him out during her performances, in the way she seemed to relax in his presence in a way she did not with anyone else. It was during the 3rd week of this routine that trouble arrived in Deming. Ranger was at the general store, buying supplies for a job he had taken tracking some cattle rustlers, when he heard raised voices outside. He stepped onto the wooden sidewalk to see 3 men on horseback confronting the sheriff, a weathered older man named Tom Garrett, who Ranger had played cards with a few times. "I am telling you, Garrett, we saw the stolen horses heading this way," the lead rider was saying. He was a hard-faced man in his 40s, with a deputy's badge pinned to his vest. "We have tracked them all the way from Las Cruces. The thief is somewhere in this town. And I am telling you, Deputy Walsh, that I know everyone in Deming and no one here is running stolen horses," Sheriff Garrett replied calmly. "You are welcome to look around, but you will do it peacefully and with respect for my jurisdiction." Deputy Walsh looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Garrett's stance must have convinced him to back down. The three riders moved off down the street, their eyes scanning every building and alley with suspicious intensity. Ranger had a bad feeling about it. He finished his business quickly and headed back to his boarding house, a rundown establishment on the edge of town run by a Mexican widow named Senora Martinez. He stabled his horse, checked his weapons out of habit, and tried to focus on planning for the rustler job. But his mind kept drifting to Felicity, to the way she had smiled at him last night, to the way her hand had felt in his. He was falling in love with her. The realization hit him like a physical blow. After 5 years of deliberate numbness, of keeping everyone at arm's length, this woman with the cathedral voice and the sad eyes had somehow slipped past all his defenses. The thought terrified him. That evening he arrived at the Silver Dollar earlier than usual. The saloon was already crowded, unusual for this time of day. Ranger quickly understood why. Deputy Walsh and his 2 companions were sitting at the bar, drinking and watching everything with those cold, suspicious eyes. Felicity was not yet on stage. Ranger claimed his usual table and waited, his unease growing with each passing minute. When she finally emerged from the back room, he saw immediately that something was wrong. Her face was even paler than usual, and her hands shook as she climbed onto the stage. Her eyes found his in the crowd, and he saw fear there. Real, visceral fear. She began to sing, but her voice was not quite steady. The usual confidence and power were muted, as if she were holding something back. The crowd did not seem to notice, but Ranger knew her well enough now to see the difference. Halfway through her second song, Deputy Walsh stood up from the bar. "Well now," he said loudly, cutting through Felicity's performance. "That is an interesting coincidence." The saloon fell silent. Felicity stopped singing, her face going from pale to ashen. "What are you talking about, Deputy?" Sheriff Garrett had appeared in the doorway, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Walsh smiled unpleasantly. "I am talking about the fact that the horse thief we have been tracking from Las Cruces is a woman. A woman who matches the description of your talented singer here. Auburn hair, pale skin, scar above her left eyebrow. The woman who stole 3 valuable horses from a rancher named Clayton Rhodes." The crowd erupted in murmurs. Ranger felt like he had been punched in the stomach. He looked at Felicity, silently begging her to deny it, to explain, but she did not deny it. She just stood there on the stage, trembling, her eyes filled with tears. "That is absurd," Dutch said from behind the bar. "Miss Kelley arrived here on foot without a horse to her name. How could she have stolen anything?" "Maybe she sold them already," Walsh said. "Or maybe they are hidden somewhere nearby. Either way, I am taking her back to Las Cruces to face charges." He started toward the stage. Ranger moved without thinking. He stepped into Walsh's path, his considerable size and the hard look in his eyes bringing the deputy up short. "You have any actual proof of this accusation?" Walsh's hand moved toward his gun. "You interfering with a lawman's duty, Cowboy. I am asking if you have proof," Ranger said calmly. "Because accusing someone based solely on physical description seems pretty thin to me. Half the women in New Mexico probably match that description. He is right, Sheriff Garrett said, moving to stand beside Ranger. You cannot just arrest someone because they have auburn hair and a scar. You need real evidence, Walsh. For a moment, Ranger thought Walsh might draw his gun. The tension in the saloon was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Walsh smiled coldly and stepped back. Fine. We will do this the legal way. Garrett, I am formally requesting that you hold this woman while I send a telegram to Las Cruces and get more information. If she is innocent, as you all seem to think, then she has nothing to worry about. Sheriff Garrett looked unhappy about it, but he nodded. Fair enough. But she will be held in my jail under my supervision and treated with respect. Understood. Perfectly, Walsh said. Ranger looked up at Felicity. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she held his gaze steadily. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that whatever she had done, she had good reason for it. I am sorry, she whispered, though whether she was apologizing to him or to the room at large, he could not tell. Sheriff Garrett climbed onto the stage and gently took her arm. Come on, Miss Kelley. I promise you will be treated fairly. As Garrett led her out of the saloon, Ranger followed. He caught up with them on the street outside. Sheriff, can I speak with her for a moment? Garrett looked between them, seeing something in Ranger's face that made him nod. 1 minute, and stay where I can see you. Ranger stepped close to Felicity, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap in her hair. Did you steal those horses? She looked up at him, and he saw resignation in her eyes. Yes. The single word hit him like a bullet, but he kept his expression neutral. Why? Because I was starving, she said quietly. Because I had not eaten in 3 days, and I was sleeping in a barn outside Las Cruces, and I saw those horses in a paddock, and I thought if I could just sell one, I could eat and have enough money to get somewhere, anywhere else. I took 3 because I thought that if I rode one and led the other 2, I could move faster. I had some foolish plan about selling them in El Paso and starting over. She laughed bitterly. But I could not do it. I made it as far as Deming, and the guilt was eating me alive. So I set the horses free in the desert, hoping they would find their way home. I suppose they did not. The rancher, Clayton Rhodes, is he a good man? Something flickered across her face. He is a rich man who throws lavish parties while his hired hands barely earn enough to survive. He owns more horses than he could ride in a lifetime. But stealing is stealing, and I did it, and now I will pay the price. Ranger wanted to pull her into his arms, to promise her everything would be all right. But they were being watched by half the town now, and such a display would only make things worse. I will figure something out, he said. There is nothing to figure out, she said. I am guilty, Ranger. You heard me confess. Whatever happens now, I deserve it. No one deserves to starve, Ranger said fiercely. And no one deserves to hang for trying to survive. Time is up, Sheriff Garrett called. Ranger watched helplessly as Garrett led Felicity away toward the jail. Deputy Walsh and his men followed, looking satisfied. The crowd that had gathered slowly dispersed, muttering among themselves. Ranger stood in the dusty street, his mind racing. If Felicity was convicted of horse theft, she would likely hang or at minimum spend years in prison. The thought was unbearable. In the space of 3 weeks, this woman had become essential to him in a way he did not fully understand. He could not let her throw her life away because she had been desperate and hungry. He spent that night asking questions. He talked to the bartender, to the saloon girls, to other patrons who had heard Felicity's story. He learned that Clayton Rhodes was indeed wealthy, that he owned a sprawling ranch outside Las Cruces with hundreds of horses and cattle. He also learned that Rhodes had a reputation for being cruel to his workers and arrogant to everyone else. The next morning, Ranger went to visit Felicity in jail. Sheriff Garrett led him into the small cell block, where Felicity sat on a narrow cot looking exhausted. "You should not be here," she said when she saw him. "Associating with a confessed horse thief will not do your reputation any good." "I do not care about my reputation," Ranger said. He gripped the bars of her cell, wishing he could reach through and touch her. "Felicity, let me help you. There has to be some way to resolve this that does not end with you in prison or worse." "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care so much? You barely know me." "Because when I listen to you sing, I remember what it feels like to be alive," Ranger said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Because when I talk to you, I remember that there is more to life than just drifting from place to place with no purpose. Because I have been dead inside for 5 years, and you are the first person who has made me want to live again." Felicity stood up and came to the bars. They were so close now he could see the flecks of green in her gray eyes. "You do not owe me anything, Ranger Cole Novak. You do not owe me your protection or your sacrifice. I made my choice when I stole those horses, and I will accept the consequences." "What if there was another way?" Ranger said. "What if I rode to Las Cruces and talked to Rhodes? Maybe we could work out some kind of restitution. I have some money saved. Not much, but maybe enough to pay him back for the horses." "He does not need your money," Felicity said. "Men like Rhodes do not care about the value of the horses. They care about making examples, about showing everyone that no one crosses them without paying the price." "Then I will find another way." She reached through the bars and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his rough beard. "You are a good man, Ranger, better than I deserve. But sometimes there is no way to fix things. Sometimes we just have to face what we have done." Ranger caught her hand and pressed it against his cheek, drinking in the warmth of her touch. "I am not giving up on you. I am not letting you throw your life away." Before she could respond, Sheriff Garrett appeared. "Sorry, Ranger, but Deputy Walsh wants to ask Miss Kelley some more questions. You will have to leave." Ranger squeezed Felicity's hand once more, trying to pour all his determination and hope into that single gesture, then reluctantly let go. He spent the rest of the day planning. If he could not convince Rhodes to drop the charges, then maybe he could find evidence that Felicity had acted under duress. Or maybe he could prove that the horses had returned home safely, making the theft moot. Or maybe, if all else failed, he could break her out of jail and take her somewhere far away where no one would ever find them. That last option was dangerous and illegal, but Ranger was surprised to find he was willing to consider it. 3 weeks ago, he would never have contemplated such a thing. But 3 weeks ago, he had been a different man. On the 3rd day of Felicity's imprisonment, the telegraph response from Las Cruces arrived. Ranger was in the general store when he heard the commotion outside and rushed out to see what was happening. Sheriff Garrett was standing in the middle of the street, holding a telegram and looking grim. Deputy Walsh stood beside him with his arms crossed, looking triumphant. "The confirmation came through," Walsh announced loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Clayton Rhodes positively identifies the woman in custody as the horse thief. He is demanding she be returned to Las Cruces immediately to stand trial." Ranger felt his world tilt. This could not be happening. He pushed through the crowd until he stood in front of Sheriff Garrett. "Sheriff, you cannot let them take her. She will not get a fair trial in Las Cruces, not if this Rhodes fellow has as much influence as people say." Garrett looked pained. "I do not have a choice, Ranger. The evidence is clear. She confessed to the crime, and now the victim has identified her. Walsh has the legal right to transport her back to his jurisdiction." "When?" Ranger asked, his voice hollow. "Tomorrow morning," Walsh said with satisfaction. "First light. We have wasted enough time in this dusty little town." Ranger spent that evening sitting outside the jail. Garrett, taking pity on him, allowed him one final visit with Felicity. She looked small and fragile in the dim light of the cell, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "You should not waste your time on me, Ranger. Go back to your life." "My life?" Ranger laughed bitterly. "I do not have a life, Felicity. I have an existence. There is a difference. But you made me remember what it was like to have a life, to have something to care about, to have a reason to wake up in the morning besides simple habit." "I am sorry," she whispered. "I am sorry I came into your life just to leave it again." Ranger gripped the bars so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Marry me." The words hung in the air between them. Felicity stared at him in shock. "What? Marry me?" Ranger repeated, the plan forming in his mind even as he spoke. "Tonight, right now. If you are my wife, I have legal standing to speak on your behalf. I can come with you to Las Cruces, hire a proper lawyer, fight for you. And if the worst happens and they convict you anyway, at least you will know that someone in this world loves you and will fight for you until their last breath." "You are insane," Felicity said, but there were tears streaming down her face. "You do not love me. You barely know me." "I know that your voice fills every empty space inside me," Ranger said fiercely. "I know that I would rather spend one day as your husband than another year drifting alone. I know that I am so completely in love with you that the thought of losing you makes it hard to breathe." "That is enough knowing for me, Ranger," she said, and he heard everything in that single word. Hope and fear and longing and love all tangled together. "Say yes," he urged. "Please, Felicity. Let me do this. Let me fight for you." She pressed her forehead against the bars, and he did the same on his side, their faces inches apart. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Sheriff Garrett agreed to perform the ceremony, though he warned them it was highly irregular. "I am authorized as a justice of the peace," he explained as he gathered a Bible and some witnesses. "But you understand this does not change the legal situation much, right? She still has to go back to Las Cruces." "I understand," Ranger said, "but it changes everything else." They were married in that tiny jail cell at midnight, with Felicity standing behind the bars and Ranger standing in front of them. Dutch came as a witness, along with Senora Martinez and two of the Saloon girls who had befriended Felicity. The ceremony was brief and awkward, conducted in the flickering light of oil lamps, but when Ranger and Felicity spoke their vows, there was nothing awkward about the emotion in their voices. "I do not have a ring," Ranger apologized after Garrett pronounced them husband and wife. "I do not need one," Felicity said. "I just need you." They could not even kiss properly with the bars between them, but Ranger reached through and cupped her face in his hands, pressing his lips to hers in the most precious kiss of his life. The next morning, Deputy Walsh was furious when he learned about the marriage, but there was nothing he could do about it. Ranger rode out with the group as they headed north toward Las Cruces, staying close to Felicity the entire way. It was a hard 2-day ride through the desert heat. Walsh made no accommodations for the fact that Felicity was a woman, pushing the pace until she swayed in the saddle from exhaustion. Ranger wanted to knock the deputy off his horse more than once, but he controlled his temper. Violence would only make things worse for Felicity. They arrived in Las Cruces on a scorching afternoon. The town was larger than Deming, with more permanent buildings and a clear sense of prosperity. Walsh took Felicity straight to the jail, a solid adobe structure that looked far more formidable than Deming's modest facility. Ranger immediately set about finding a lawyer. It took him the rest of the day and a significant portion of his savings, but he finally found a man willing to take the case. His name was Samuel Pritchard, a middle-aged attorney with an honest face and a reputation for fighting lost causes. "I will not lie to you, Mr. Novak," Pritchard said after Ranger explained the situation. "This is going to be difficult. Horse theft is a hanging offense in this territory, and Clayton Rhodes is an influential man. He sits on the town council and has the ear of the territorial governor. If he wants to make an example of your wife, he has the power to do it." "What are our options?" Ranger asked. "We argue that your wife was desperate, that she acted out of necessity rather than criminal intent. We hope the judge shows mercy. And we pray that Rhodes might be convinced to show leniency if proper restitution is made." "How much restitution?" Pritchard named a figure that made Ranger's stomach drop. It was more than he had saved, more than he could earn in a year of honest work. "I will find a way," Ranger said. Over the next week, while Felicity awaited trial, Ranger worked like a man possessed. He took any job he could find. He broke horses for a local rancher, worked as a bouncer at a saloon, even signed on for a dangerous run protecting a silver shipment from bandits. He slept 4 hours a night and spent every spare moment sitting outside Felicity's cell, talking to her through the small barred window. "You are going to kill yourself," she told him one evening, seeing the exhaustion in his face. "Please, Ranger, stop this. Even if you raise the money, there is no guarantee Rhodes will accept it." "I have to try," Ranger said. "You are my wife. I made a vow to protect you." "You made that vow 3 weeks ago," she said. "You barely know me." "I know everything that matters," Ranger said. "I know you are brave and talented and stronger than you give yourself credit for. I know that you sing like an angel and you think about others before yourself. I know that I love you more than I thought I could ever love anyone again. That is all I need to know." The trial was set for the following Monday. On the Saturday before, Ranger made a desperate decision. He went to see Clayton Rhodes himself. The Rhodes Ranch was enormous, sprawling across thousands of acres of prime land along the Rio Grande. The main house was a sprawling adobe mansion that looked wildly out of place in the desert landscape. Ranger had to talk his way past 2 hired guards just to reach the front door. Rhodes himself was a tall, lean man in his 50s with cold blue eyes and an air of absolute authority. He received Ranger in a study lined with expensive books and furniture that must have been shipped from back east at enormous cost. "Mr. Novak," Rhodes said, gesturing to a chair. "I understand you are married to the horse thief." "Her name is Felicity," Ranger said, refusing to sit. "And yes, I am her husband. A hasty marriage from what I hear, conducted in a jail cell in Deming." Rhodes smiled unpleasantly. "Trying to complicate the legal proceedings, I assume." "I married her because I love her," Ranger said, "and I am here to offer restitution for the horses. Are you?" Rhodes leaned back in his chair, studying Ranger like a scientist examining an interesting insect. "And how much restitution can a drifting cowboy possibly offer?" Ranger placed a leather pouch on Rhodes's desk. It contained every cent he had earned in the past week, plus everything he had saved from before. "It is not the full value of 3 horses," he admitted, "but it is everything I have. I am also prepared to work off the remainder. I can break horses, work cattle, do whatever you need." Rhodes did not even look at the pouch. "You misunderstand the situation, Mr. Novak. This is not about money. I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. This is about respect. Your wife thought she could steal from me without consequences. I need to show everyone in this territory that Clayton Rhodes is not a man to be crossed." "She was starving," Ranger said, his temper flaring. "She made a mistake out of desperation. Is your pride really worth a woman's life?" "My pride, as you call it, is what keeps order in this lawless territory," Rhodes said coldly. "Without men like me setting examples, this place would descend into complete chaos. Your wife will hang as a warning to other thieves. That is final." Ranger felt rage boiling up inside him, but he forced it down. Violence against Rhodes would only seal Felicity's fate. You are condemning a good woman to death over 3 horses you probably do not even remember owning. What kind of man does that make you? A practical one, Rhodes said. He stood and walked to the door, opening it to signal the conversation was over. Now get off my property before I have you thrown off. Ranger grabbed his money pouch and left, his mind racing. If Rhodes would not show mercy, then he would have to find another way. The trial was held in a small courtroom that smelled of dust and old wood. The judge was an elderly man named Hargrove, who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. Ranger sat in the front row, his eyes never leaving Felicity as she stood before the court in her green dress, looking pale but composed. The prosecution presented their case efficiently. Deputy Walsh testified about tracking the stolen horses. Rhodes testified about the theft and the value of his property. The evidence was damning and straightforward. When it was the defense's turn, Samuel Pritchard did his best. He called Felicity to the stand and let her tell her story, every heartbreaking detail of her father's death, her poverty, her desperation. He argued eloquently about the difference between a hardened criminal and a desperate woman who made a terrible mistake. He even called character witnesses, from Deming, who testified to Felicity's good character and beautiful singing. Ranger himself testified, telling the court about how Felicity had shown remorse, how she had released the horses rather than profit from her crime. He spoke about her kindness and talent, about how she had transformed the rough atmosphere of the Silver Dollar Saloon into something approaching grace. But he could see in Judge Hargrove's face that it was not enough. Rhodes sat in the gallery with a satisfied expression, confident in his influence. When the judge announced he would deliver his verdict the following morning, Ranger felt time running out like sand through his fingers. That night, he sat in the small hotel room he had rented and seriously considered breaking Felicity out of jail. He had his gun, his horse, and enough desperation to attempt almost anything. But Felicity had made him promise not to do anything foolish. "I will not have you become a criminal on my account," she had told him firmly during their last visit. "If I hang, I hang. But you will go on living, Ranger Cole Novak. You will remember that you are capable of love and you will find happiness again someday. Promise me." He had promised, though the words had tasted like ash in his mouth. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, unusual for the desert. Ranger dressed carefully in his best clothes and walked to the courthouse with the feeling of walking to his own execution. The courtroom was packed. Apparently word had spread about the case, and half the town had turned out to see the verdict. Ranger took his seat in the front row, his eyes locked on Felicity as she was brought in by a guard. She looked at him, and he saw love and resignation in her eyes. She had accepted her fate. But Ranger had not, and would not. Judge Hargrove entered, and everyone stood. The old man took his seat behind the bench and shuffled through some papers before looking up at Felicity. "Miss Kelley, or I suppose it is Mrs. Novak now," he began. "You have been found guilty of stealing 3 horses valued at a considerable sum. The law is clear about the punishment for such a crime." Ranger felt his world collapsing. "However," the judge continued, "this court recognizes that there are circumstances to consider. You acted out of desperation rather than malice. You showed remorse by releasing the horses, and you have demonstrated good character both in your past and in your brief time in Deming." Hope flickered in Ranger's chest. "Therefore, this court sentences you to 5 years' imprisonment at the Territorial Prison in Santa Fe, with the possibility of early release for good behavior." The courtroom erupted. Rhodes stood up, his face red with anger. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. The law demands hanging for horse theft." "The law allows for judicial discretion, Mr. Rhodes," Judge Hargrove said firmly. "And I have exercised that discretion. This court is adjourned." Ranger barely heard the rest. 5 years. Not hanging, but 5 years of Felicity locked away in a prison. It was better than death, but it still felt like a crushing defeat. He pushed through the crowd to reach her before the guards could take her away. "Felicity," she turned, tears streaming down her face. "I am sorry. I am so sorry, Ranger." "I will wait for you," he said, gripping her hands tightly. 5 years, 10 years, it does not matter. I will wait as long as it takes." "You should not," she said. "You should move on, find someone else, have the life you deserve." "You are the life I deserve," Ranger said fiercely. "I will be waiting when you get out. That is a promise." The guards pulled her away then, and Ranger watched helplessly as they led her out of the courthouse toward a wagon that would take her to Santa Fe. The next few days passed in a blur. Ranger stayed in Las Cruces, trying to figure out what to do next. He could not just leave Felicity to face 5 years in prison alone. There had to be something he could do. It was on the 4th day after the trial that opportunity came from an unexpected source. Ranger was sitting in a cantina, nursing a beer and feeling sorry for himself, when a well-dressed Mexican man approached his table. "Mr. Novak, my name is Eduardo Mendoza. I work for Don Sebastian Alvarez, who owns a large ranch north of here. He would like to speak with you about a business proposition." Ranger had heard of Don Sebastian Alvarez. The man was almost as wealthy and influential as Clayton Rhodes, with holdings that stretched across southern New Mexico and into Mexico itself. "What kind of business?" Ranger asked warily. "Don Sebastian heard about your wife's trial. He was impressed by your loyalty and your character. He would like to offer you employment with the possibility of earning enough money to potentially arrange your wife's early release." It sounded too good to be true, but Ranger was desperate enough to listen. He followed Mendoza to a grand hacienda on the outskirts of town, where Don Sebastian received him in a courtyard filled with flowers and fountains. Don Sebastian was an elderly gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes. He offered Ranger wine and spoke to him in accented but perfect English. "Mr. Novak, I will be direct with you. I need men I can trust for a difficult job. I have a herd of cattle, nearly 2,000 head, that need to be driven north to the railroad at Socorro. It is a dangerous route through Apache territory and past several outlaw hideouts. Most men would not attempt such a drive, but if successful, the profits would be substantial. I am prepared to offer you a foreman's position with a generous salary and a bonus upon successful completion." Ranger did his calculations quickly. The amount Don Sebastian was offering, combined with what he had already saved, would be enough to hire better lawyers, maybe even bribe the right officials to secure Felicity's early release. "Why me?" Ranger asked. "You do not know me." "I know you married a woman in a jail cell and spent every cent you had trying to save her," Don Sebastian said. "That tells me you are a man of honor and loyalty. Those are the men I need for this job. Also, I will be honest with you. Clayton Rhodes and I are business rivals. The thought of helping you defy him brings me a certain satisfaction." Ranger smiled grimly. "When do we leave?" The cattle drive took 3 months. It was grueling, dangerous work. They fought off rustlers twice, weathered a flash flood that nearly scattered the entire herd, and negotiated safe passage through Apache lands by trading food and supplies. Ranger earned every cent of his pay and more, but he also earned something more valuable than money. The men he worked with became friends. He remembered what it was like to be part of something larger than himself, to work toward a common goal, to trust others and be trusted in return. When they finally delivered the cattle to Socorro, and Don Sebastian paid him his salary plus the promised bonus, Ranger felt something he had not felt in 5 years. Purpose. He used the money exactly as he had planned. He hired 3 different lawyers, each of whom filed petitions for Felicity's early release based on various legal grounds. He made discreet payments to prison officials to ensure she was well treated. He even hired investigators to look into Clayton Rhodes's business dealings, hoping to find leverage. It took another year of legal battles, but finally, miraculously, the territorial governor signed a pardon reducing Felicity's sentence to time served. The official reason was overcrowding at the prison and her exemplary behavior. The unofficial reason was the legal pressure and the quiet influence of Don Sebastian, who had taken a personal interest in the case. Ranger was waiting outside the prison in Santa Fe on the day of her release. He had not seen her in 18 months, and his heart pounded as the gates opened and she walked out into the sunlight. She looked thinner, paler, but when she saw him, her face transformed with joy. They ran to each other and collided in an embrace that felt like coming home. Ranger lifted her off her feet and spun her around, laughing and crying at the same time. "You waited," she said when he finally set her down. "I promised I would," Ranger said, cupping her face in his hands. "I will always wait for you, Felicity. Always." They were married again in a proper ceremony in Las Cruces, with Don Sebastian serving as a witness and providing the celebration at his hacienda. Ranger had arranged everything carefully. He had used the remainder of his money to purchase a small ranch on the outskirts of Deming, a modest spread with good water rights and enough land to run cattle or horses. "It is not much," he told Felicity as they rode toward their new home, "but it is ours." "It is perfect," she said, looking at the small adobe house with its covered porch and views of the distant mountains. "It is home." They settled into their new life with the kind of joy that only comes from having survived hardship together. Ranger worked the ranch, building the herd slowly but steadily. Felicity started giving music lessons to children in Deming, her beautiful voice finally being used to teach and inspire rather than simply survive. On Saturday nights, she would sing at the Silver Dollar, but now it was different. Now she sang as a respectable married woman, not a desperate girl looking for tips. The crowd still fell silent when she performed, her voice still transforming the rough saloon into something approaching a cathedral. But now, when she sang, her eyes would find Ranger in his corner table, and she would smile, and he would know that every hardship had been worth it for this moment. 2 years after her release, Felicity gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Grace. Ranger held the tiny baby in his arms and wept, finally allowing himself to grieve properly for the family he had lost, and to celebrate the family he had found. 3 years after that, a son arrived, whom they named Samuel after the lawyer who had fought for Felicity at her trial. Their small ranch grew prosperous, not wealthy but comfortable. Ranger proved to have a gift for breeding horses, and soon people came from all over southern New Mexico to buy his stock. Felicity's music school expanded until she had nearly 20 students, children from all over the territory who came to learn from the woman with the cathedral voice. Some of them showed real talent, and Felicity took pride in nurturing their gifts the way her father had nurtured hers. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ranger took Felicity back to the Silver Dollar Saloon. Dutch was still running the place, though he was grayer and slower now. The saloon was packed for the special occasion, every table full, standing room only in the back. Felicity climbed onto the familiar stage and Ranger took his usual corner table. She looked out at the crowd, then directly at him, and began to sing. She sang Amazing Grace, the same hymn she had sung that first night 10 years ago. But now the words carried different meaning. Now when she sang about being lost, and then found, about grace that saved a wretch like her, she was singing their story. The story of two broken people who had found each other in the most unlikely place and had built something beautiful from the wreckage of their pasts. The saloon fell silent, just as it had that first night. Her voice filled the space like a cathedral, soaring and pure and full of hard-won joy. Ranger sat with his untouched whiskey, just listening, marveling at how a single voice could change everything. When the song ended, the applause was thunderous, but Ranger did not join in. He just sat there, tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed with gratitude for the miracle of having found this woman, this life, this unexpected grace. After the performance, Felicity came to his table. They did not need to speak. She simply took his hand and they walked out into the warm New Mexico night together. They stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the saloon, looking up at the stars that blazed across the desert sky. Ranger pulled Felicity close, and she rested her head against his chest. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" she asked quietly. "If you had not been in the saloon that night, if you had not stood up for me when Deputy Walsh came, all the time," Ranger admitted. "And every time I do, I thank God that I was there, that I heard you sing, that I was given the chance to love you." "I was so afraid," Felicity said. "Back then, in that jail cell, I thought my life was over. I thought I would hang or spend the rest of my life in prison. I never imagined this. A home, a family, a husband who loves me, students who look up to me. It still feels like a dream sometimes." "If it is a dream, then I hope we never wake up," Ranger said. They stood there for a long time, holding each other under the stars, two survivors who had found their way to happiness through heartbreak and grace. 15 years after that first night in the Silver Dollar, Ranger sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of orange and gold. He was older now, his hair shot through with silver, his hands scarred from years of ranch work. But he had never been happier. Inside the house, he could hear Felicity teaching a lesson to one of her students. Her voice drifted out through the open window, guiding the young girl through a complex melody with patience and encouragement. In the corral, their son Samuel was working with a young horse, displaying the same natural gift with animals that Ranger himself had. And somewhere in Deming, their daughter Grace was shopping with friends, a bright and confident young woman of 13 who had inherited her mother's beauty and her father's determination. Don Sebastian had passed away 2 years ago, leaving Ranger a generous sum in his will along with a letter thanking him for reminding him that honor and loyalty still existed in the world. Clayton Rhodes had lost most of his fortune in some bad investments and had retreated to California, a bitter and broken man. Sheriff Garrett had retired, and the new sheriff often came to Ranger for advice on matters of law and justice. The world had changed, and so had they. But some things remained constant. Every Saturday night, if she was not too tired, Felicity would sing at the Silver Dollar. And every Saturday night, Ranger would sit at his corner table with a glass of whiskey he never drank, just listening to the voice that had saved his life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Felicity came out onto the porch and sat beside him. They did not speak, just sat together in comfortable silence, watching the day fade into night. "I love you," Ranger said finally, the words as true and essential as they had been 10 years ago as they would be 10 years from now. "I love you too," Felicity replied, taking his hand. "Thank you for saving me." "You saved me first," Ranger said. "The moment you started to sing, you saved me." They sat on the porch as the stars began to emerge one by one, filling the desert sky with light. Inside the house, their children laughed about something. In the corral, the horses settled down for the night, and in the distance, a coyote called out to the rising moon. It was an ordinary evening in an ordinary life, and it was everything Ranger Cole Novak had never dared to hope for. A home, a family, and a woman whose voice could transform even the roughest saloon into a cathedral, whose love had given him a reason to live again. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and creosote. Felicity leaned her head on Ranger's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. They had been through fire and survived. They had faced impossible odds and won. They had taken 2 broken lives and built something whole and beautiful. As darkness settled over the New Mexico landscape, Ranger thought about that night 18 years ago when he had sat in the Silver Dollar with a glass of whiskey halfway to his lips and heard a voice that changed everything. If someone had told him then that he would end up here, with this woman, with this life, he would never have believed it. But life had a way of surprising you. Sometimes, if you were very lucky, it surprised you with grace. Inside the house, one of Felicity's students hit a perfect high note, and Felicity smiled with pride. Samuel called out that he had finished with the horse, and Ranger shouted back his approval. A rider approached down the long dirt road, probably a customer interested in buying horses. This was their life now, full and busy and sometimes chaotic, but always filled with love. The past, with all its pain and loss, had not disappeared, but it had been transformed into something bearable, even meaningful. Ranger still thought about Mary and Sarah sometimes, but now he could remember them with fondness rather than crushing guilt. He knew they would have wanted him to be happy, to find love again, to build a new life. And what a life it was. "Come on," Felicity said, standing and pulling him to his feet. "Dinner is almost ready, and you know how the children get if we are late." Ranger followed her inside, into the warm glow of lamplight and the sound of his children's voices. He paused at the threshold and looked back one more time at the desert landscape, at the vast sky full of stars, at the life he and Felicity had built together from nothing but hope and determination and love. Then he stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him, and sat down to dinner with his family. Their laughter filled the small house, mixing with the clink of dishes and the scrape of chairs, the ordinary sounds of an extraordinary life. And if sometimes, late at night, Ranger would wake and listen to Felicity breathing beside him and marvel at how completely she had transformed his existence, well, that was his secret to keep. She had filled his life the way her voice had filled that saloon so many years ago, turning every empty space into something sacred, every ordinary moment into grace. They grew old together on that small ranch outside Deming. They watched their children grow up, marry, and have children of their own. They celebrated anniversaries and weathered hardships, and never once took for granted the miracle of having found each other. When Ranger was 65 and Felicity was 63, they stood together in the Silver Dollar Saloon one last time. Dutch had long since passed away, and the saloon had changed hands twice, but the new owner had agreed to host a special anniversary celebration. The place was packed with friends and family and people whose lives they had touched over the decades. Felicity, her hair now white but her posture still graceful, climbed onto the stage one final time. She sang Amazing Grace, her voice not as strong as it once was, but somehow even more beautiful for all the years and experience it carried. And Ranger sat at his corner table, exactly where he had sat 43 years ago, and listened to his wife sing. When she finished, the applause was deafening. But Ranger just sat there, tears streaming down his weathered face, remembering the lost man he had been and marveling at the blessed man he had become. Felicity came to him then, moving slowly on aging knees, and sat beside him. They looked at each other, and in her eyes he saw their entire life together. Every struggle, every triumph, every moment of love and laughter and grace. "Thank you," Ranger said, "for filling my life with music." "Thank you," Felicity replied, "for giving me a reason to sing." They sat together in that corner of the silver-dollar saloon, holding hands like young lovers, while around them their family and friends celebrated. The saloon was loud and rowdy and full of life, but in their corner there was peace. Ranger thought about the whiskey glass he had forgotten all those years ago, arrested halfway to his lips by the sound of an angel's voice. He thought about all the choices that had led him to that moment, and all the choices that had followed. He thought about grace and redemption and second chances, and he thanked whatever force in the universe had brought him to that saloon on that particular night, had made him stop and listen, had given him the courage to love again after he thought his heart had died. Outside, the New Mexico sun was setting over the desert they both loved. Inside, surrounded by the people they cherished, Ranger and Felicity sat together in their corner and held each other close. They had started as two broken strangers in a rough saloon. They had survived theft and trial and separation, and every hardship the Wild West could throw at them. And they had built something beautiful, something lasting, something that would echo through their children and grandchildren for generations to come. It was a love story written in the dust and heat of the desert, in the notes of hymns and folk songs, in the hard work of building a life from nothing. It was their story, and it was complete. As the celebration continued around them, Ranger leaned over and kissed his wife gently. "I love you, Felicity Cole Novak, yesterday, today, and forever." "And I love you, Ranger," she replied, her eyes shining with joy. "My heart, my home, my salvation." They stayed until the last guest left, until the lamps burned low and the bartender started sweeping up. Then they walked out into the cool New Mexico night, arm in arm, still together after all these years. The stars blazed overhead, the same stars that had watched over them through decades of life. And somewhere in the distance, if you listened very carefully, you could almost hear the echo of a voice like a cathedral, singing of grace and love and happily ever after.